terms of place, okay, we're having a really long winter.
Right.
Yeah, pretty strange. Lots and rain
Oh
and
gosh.
wind. Yeah, we've had rain for the last 4 months or so.
Really? Gosh.
It's really, really annoying,
It's bizarrely, it's the opposite here. So we haven't had rain, which is really unusual for, especially for this part of England. We haven't had it for about 6 weeks. We've just had there's been no rain, and so the reservoirs are really low, and yeah, it's quite warm. But yeah, there's been
Right.
no rain whatsoever.
Right. So we now know where the good weather is going. So
For
going
now.
your way. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Wow. So everything is green here. It looks like the north of Spain
Oh
or
gosh.
England or Ireland. We're turning green here.
Right.
Yep. All right, Viorica, should we wait some more? Viorica? Oh, she'll be right back,
See.
I guess.
No, no, I was here, but I was talking to myself.
Okay, all right. That always helps.
I forgot that I had muted myself. I think you can start. There's no
Okay, so do you
five
want to
o'clock, so
say something first, Viorica? And
no, I just I'm happy to have you here, and I will have Ana Maria Manzanas introduce you to the students.
Oh, thank you.
okay, all right. Thank you, Viorica. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce David Cooper. Who's a senior lecturer in English at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, where with creative nonfiction writer Rachel Lichtenstein has established and continues to direct the Center for Place Writing. So you'll hear a lot of place and wheres and heres. So he's co-founding co-editor of the International Interdisciplinary Journal Literary Geographies, and he's also the co-editor of Poetry and Geography, Space and Place in Post-War Poetry, and Literary Mapping in the Digital Age. And more recently, he has co-edited with Neil Alexander the monumental and colossal The Routledge Handbook of Literary Geographies, in which I had the pleasure and honor to participate. So he's currently completing a monograph on the immersiveness of contemporary British and Irish place writing for Liverpool University Press, and that's what he's going to talk about today. So David's own place writing includes the creative critical pamphlet, the Duden, is that the right pronunciation? Duden?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Duden estuary, the myriad lines of its relations. So he's also co-investigator on Voices of the Future, an interdisciplinary project funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, exploring the relationship between young people and treescapes. I fully identify with that. And in 2024, he was appointed to a fellow of the English Association in the UK in recognition of his distinguished service to the discipline. And if I may, and before I yield the floor, I'd like to read a quote from the Duden Estuary that I found online. I found it online, and it is about lines. And I thought it's just so such beautiful writing. So poetry is the literature of lines. It begins, of course, with the lines of individual letters, the textual inscriptions on the page of a material notebook, or the summoning up of digital markings on the screen. To write with a pencil or a keyboard is to mark, to write is to make lines. This is so pretty. So, David, welcome to Salamanca, this time online. It's great to have you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for that generous introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen if that's okay. Can people see my slides? Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Fine.
Okay, well, thank you again for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak as part of the series. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think I'd much prefer to be where you are at the moment, but yeah, thank you anyway. We'll have to do it online. So I'm going to speak about something called place writing, and to begin, I wanted to just offer a couple of quotations. And the first is by the American philosopher Edward S. Casey, and it says, "This much is true of place. We immersed in it and could not do without it." The second quotation is from a contemporary English novelist called Andrew Michael Hurley. And Hurley writes, "And so to write about a place is to try and anchor ourselves in the world somehow as it shifts endlessly around us." And I'm not going to come back explicitly to those two quotations, but I just wanted to have them there in the back of our minds as we go through this talk. And this talk or this lecture is going to be split into three sections. So first of all, I wanted to say a bit about place writing and offer a definition of this thing, this type of writing I'm categorizing as place writing. And central to this is the idea of this writing being immersive. So in the second section, I want to sort of pull back from place writing to think a bit more about immersion and what that might mean in different theoretical contexts. Then in the third and final section, I want to apply that theoretical thinking to an example of contemporary British place writing. And it'll just be a very short final section, but to give a sense of how place writing might work in terms of its immersiveness. So that's a broad map, if you like, of what I want us to do. Part one then, or section one, is thinking about place writing and inching or moving towards a definition. And in 2020, I contributed an essay to the Routledge Handbook of Place, in which I attempted to move towards a provisional definition of British place writing. I began that essay with the assertion that place in contemporary British literature is everywhere, and that's on the screen. Building on this initial observation, I suggested that over the course of the 2010s, the term place writing had increasingly entered creative and critical literary discourse, but had yet to receive substantial scholarly scrutiny. I then posed a series of critical questions, which are again on the screen. What are the cardinal characteristics of such work? Is place writing associated with a particular literary form, or is it applied as a generic category? What are the dominant thematic tropes in contemporary place writing? How do writers use literary forms and language to reconfigure and or reinscribe extant understandings of place and placelessness? The short chapter that I wrote then formulated some initial responses to these questions to suggest that the term place writing might be applied to any piece of writing which places place at its imaginative centre. In order to clarify this understanding of the term, I found an analogy in Zachary Leader's interrogation of life writing as, and I quote, a generic term used to describe a range of writings about lives or parts of lives, which provide materials out of which lives or parts of lives are composed, end quote. According to Leader, these writings straightforwardly include memoir, autobiography, biography, diaries. But saliently, he suggests that life writing can also refer to both autobiographical and biographical fiction. Leader further complicates the genre of life writing by proposing that it includes a range of non-literary texts, and again, in quote, including letters, writs, wills, written anecdotes, depositions, court proceedings, marginalia, nonsense writings, lyric poems, scientific and historical writings, and digital forms, including blogs, tweets, Facebook entries, end quote. In my chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Place, then, I argued that the term place writing might be understood to be a helpfully broad critical label that can capture the rich heterogeneity of contemporary texts across a range of forms that think deeply and complicatedly about place and its many meanings. I still subscribe to this pluralistic understanding of place writing, and it is an openness which underpins the collaborative co-produced research emerging out of the Centre for Place Writing at Manchester Metropolitan University. In other words, I have no literary critical desire to police the borders of what might be classified as place writing. Recently, however, I've refined this critical position. That is to say, although I still believe that, as with life or travel writing, say, place writing is a label that can be applied to a diverse range of texts, the term performs its most important work, I would argue, when it enables readers to gain an immediate imaginative purchase on creative non-fictional texts that defy conventional classification. In other words, it is a term that usefully describes literary works that fall outside or in between existing categorizations through the braiding of various recognizable genres of creative non-fictional writing. This idea that generic hybridity is a defining characteristic of place writing is voiced by the cultural historian Joe Moran, who says that it is a fluid, and I quote, and polymorphous genre of creative non-fiction that typically interweaves personal witness, family memoir, amateur field biology, folklore, social and cultural history, eco-criticism, and nature and topographical writing. Moran's list is by no means exhausted, as the methodological interest to be found in place writing texts might also include anthropology and ethnography, cartographic history, and spatial theory, to name just 4 more areas of interest. Yet rightly, in my view, Moran's definition indicates that the term place writing has its greatest efficacy when applied to hybridized texts, for which, as Kathleen Jamie has put it, there doesn't really seem to be a word. The growing prominence of place writing during the 2010s can be traced in the back catalogues of small independent presses in the UK and Ireland, such as Penned in the Margins, Little Toller, and Uniform Books. It can be similarly found by searching the digital archives of the popular Caught by the River website and Little Toller's influential online journal, The Clearing, as well as issues of the magazines Archipelago and Elsewhere, a journal of place. The mainstreaming of place writing can also be evidenced by 2 landmark collections published at either end of the decade. In 2010 to 2011, the London-based cultural organisation Art Events coordinated the Reenchantment, a national project that sought to interrogate the various meanings of place in the 21st century. The programme had 5 creative outputs, including Towards Reenchantment, Place and Its Meanings, which you can see on the screen, a collection of new writing edited by Gareth Evans and Di Robson. The editors eschewed a conventional introduction in favour of a 3-sentence note on the front cover that begins by proffering its contents as literary panacea. And the first sentence says, "Here are paths offered like an open hand towards a new way of being in the world." Evans and Robson's words implicitly, but perhaps inadvertently, invoke the phenomenological language of Martin Heidegger, who famously used the compound expression being in the world to articulate his anti-Cartesian understanding of how the groundedness of everyday experience is based on the indivisibility of subject and object, self and environment. The Heideggerian tone continues in the following sentence as Evans and Robson assert, and again this is on the screen, that at a time when the multiple alienations of modern society threaten our sense of belonging, the importance of place to creative possibility in life and art cannot be underestimated. They then end their brief note by indicating how Towards Reenchantment, Place and Its Meanings reflects in remarkable prose and poetry on specific locations from across the diverse landscapes of the British Isles and on the potential for re-enchantment, whether personal or collective, cultural, ecological, or spiritual. Here, Evans and Robson establish their interest in how the site-specific writing they've brought together opens the possibility to be, as Jane Bennett puts it, struck and shaken by the extraordinary that lives amid the familiar and the everyday. Towards Reenchantment, therefore, is immediately set up as a book that is preoccupied with the experiential and imaginative thickness generated through a sense of belonging to a particular place. Excuse me. As I've just indicated, Towards Reenchantment contains poetry. The dominant literary mode in the book, however, is creative non-fictional prose, with 7 of the 11 contributions taking the form of autobiographical essays from leading writers such as Kathleen Jamie and Robert Macfarlane, Richard Mabey and Ian Sinclair, Jay Griffiths and Ken Walpole. 8 years later, another key anthology built upon some of the principal characteristics and tropes of Towards Reenchantment. Edited by the non-fiction writer and BBC radio producer Tim Dee, Groundwork, Writings on Places and People, features contributions by 31 writers and artists, including Mabey and Walpole. As with Towards Reenchantment, it is explicitly place, in all its knotty and contradictory meanings, that provides the experiential and imaginative foundations for Dee's book. In contrast to the earlier collection, however, Groundwork is prefaced by a comparatively expansive and poetically polemical introduction in which Dee examines how places are, and I quote, anthropogenic creations called into being by the meeting of humans and their environment, end quote. Saliently, Dee uses the hyphenated compound place writing to refer to the new work gathered in the pages of his book. He does not trace the lineage of this term, nor does he interrogate his own use of the label. Yet it is striking that through this absence of editorial contextualization, there's an implicit assumption the reader will share his understanding of what place writing might be and do. Given that this term does not feature in a brief prefatory note towards Reenchantment, Dee's confident use of the term illustrates how, between 2010 and 2018, the label place writing had flowed into the literary mainstream. Connected with this, it is significant that whereas Towards Reenchantment was issued with a limited print run by a relatively small arts organisation, Groundwork was published by the Penguin Random House-owned imprint Jonathan Cape as a not inexpensive hardback. Throughout the introduction, Dee's language carries the Heideggerian connotations evident in the introductory note to Towards Reenchantment, as he contends that place writing carries the capacity to remind the reader of the placeness of place, in an age in which most of the time, most of us are unplaced. Dee frames such writing as a creative counter to the spatial abstractions of late capitalist neoliberalism, a world in which specificities have been dulled, local habitations and names globalized, the interest or hexaity of every street or field driven from common memory. In other words, place writing for Dee has the potential to highlight and celebrate what the environmental charity Common Ground refers to as local distinctiveness, the diverse, local and intimate connections that people have had and might yet have with the landscape that surrounds them. Moreover, such literary work can offer an imaginative antidote to how everyday experience increasingly unfolds within what Dee calls untextured places, the unmuddy world of the depthless screen, which I'm on at the moment, and the sealed space. According to Dee, therefore, place writing has the capacity to remind the reader of what the phenomenological thinker David Seaman refers to as the lived emplacement of being in the world. Groundwork is shaped by topographical variousness, with the personal geographies articulated within the collection coming from as many acres as people, and taking the reader around the British and Irish archipelago and beyond. In terms of literary form, however, Groundwork is characterised by a degree of uniformity, since the dominant mode, as in Towards Reenchantment, is the lyric essay, autobiographical writing in which writers voice what Seaman describes as the indivisible, normally unnoticed phenomenon of person experiencing place. Over the past 15 years or so, the type of creative non-fictional place writing showcased in both of these books has become increasingly prominent in the literary landscape of Britain and Ireland. Uniting this work is the shared preoccupation with capturing what Robert Macfarlane has described as the undiscovered country of the nearby, or what Seamus Heaney has memorably referred to in a discussion of the experience of reading the place poetry of John Clare, is the inexorable one thing after anotherness of what it means to be in the world. It is possible to identify further points of convergence across all these different types of place writings, and some of these are listed on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll leave that slide here. So these are some of the key characteristics of creative non-fictional place writing, I think. So I'm not going to go through them all, but what I do want to do is call attention to the last one and to underscore my critical interest in the way many of these texts have been described as immersive works of literature. When publishers or reviewers use that term, however, it is applied without clarification or explanation. Yet a sequence of questions are instantly raised by it. Does immersive refer to writing? Is the term used to characterize some apparently intrinsic features of the literary work? Alternatively, does immersive refer to the experience of reading? In other words, is it a term used by publishers, endorsers, and reviewers to describe the interiorized experience of imaginatively inhabiting the textual spaces of such works? In order to begin addressing such questions, it is, as ever, illuminating to turn to the Oxford English Dictionary to consider how the word immersion has been defined. In short, the OED offers three key definitions, which are summarized on the slide. So the first refers to the physical experience or the material experience or practice of dipping or plunging something into water or another liquid. The second main meaning is more symbolic, and is the administration of Christian baptism by the dipping and plunging of the whole person into water. The third definition is metaphorical and refers to the absorption in some condition, action, interest, etc. We become immersed in our studies, or we become immersed in whatever activity we might do. So there's those three definitions. In order to, I want to have those definitions in the back of my head, but also I want to, in order to think about the immersiveness of creative non-fictional place writing, it's similarly illuminating to consider how over recent years, this term immersion is becoming increasingly prevalent across different cultural forms. In the dramatic arts, for example, immersive theatre has become a prominent mode of site-specific practice, in which the absence of a formal stage leads to a fluid intermingling of performers and members of the audience. An innovative dismantling of the fourth wall, in which the audience become active participants in the unfolding of the narrative. In the visual arts, on the other hand, the affordances of digital technologies have been increasingly harnessed to create immersive experiences. Installations in which images and videos of the familiar paintings of Vincent van Gogh or Gustav Klimt, to name just two, are projected onto walls to the accompaniment of animations, narrations, music, and even fragrances. In such instances, a diverse range of spaces, from traditional galleries to abandoned warehouses, are transformed into hybrid places in which the visitor is exposed to a richly multisensory experience. Ideas of immersion and immersiveness can also actually be traced in commercial offerings of a wide range of immersive experiences, inverted commas, from the drinking of cocktails in a reconstructed Alcatraz prison cell to the playing of life-size board games. Contemporary immersive cultural experiences, therefore, are characterized by their heterogeneity. The immersive practices I've just listed, though, share a common characteristic that they're all premised on the creation of embodied experiences. So in each instance, the paying cultural consumer self-consciously enters a carefully curated and choreographed physical environment, apparently set apart from the routine materialities and habitual rhythms of the practice of everyday life. As Alison Griffiths has put it, the immersee experiences the sensation of entering a space that immediately identifies itself as somehow separate from the world. Clearly, though, the immersee is incapable of pulling off the impossible task of separating themselves from their own body. Rather, in those seemingly bounded spaces, the immersee is persistently and insistently reminded of their own corporeality through the deliberate activation and often overwhelming bombardment of multiple senses. So all of this thinking is around these cultural experiences of immersion. What I want to argue, though, is literary immersion, of course, is of a different order. The exploration of the immersiveness of British and Irish place writing, then, can be informed by three intersecting lines of critical inquiry, which are on the slide. So first, what does immersive mean within a literary context? Second, how do place writers generate the imaginative interest of readers who might not have any interest or prior knowledge of the places that are being subjected to literary representation? And connected with that, how do place writers, through a combination of entanglement of formal literary sort of structures or devices and representation of geographical immersion, how do they bring these two things together, the sort of narrative structures on one hand, geographical representation on the other? How are these brought together to create readerly immersion, to immerse the reader in the worlds that are being created? So in the next section of the talk, I want to shift the focus from place writing to briefly map out some of the theoretical coordinates, which might facilitate the critical exploration of this notion of literary immersiveness. And I want to do this by saying that maybe thinking about the immersiveness of place writing, in order to do this, we can think about three theoretical contexts. One is something called text world theory. The second is theoretical reflections on story worlds. And the third are theoretical reflections on geographical practice or experience. And I'll just go through these briefly one by one. The first theoretical frame is offered by the work of cognitive linguists who presented their research under the term text world theory. A key moment in the field of cognitive stylistics was the publication of work by Paul Wirth in the late 1980s and early 90s, which provided the theoretical foundations for the development of this so-called text world theory, which is practiced today by Joanna Gavins and others. In an article published in 1994, Wirth defines text world as a conceptual space containing all the information necessary to participate in a given discourse. In other words, when a human subject engages with language, whether that be a sort of conversation at a bus stop or the reading of an epic poem, say, they make sense of that language through internal cognitive processing that leads to the largely unconscious construction of internal mental models. And Wirth complicates this and builds up a complex cognitive framework, which begins with the observation that several kinds of information handling contribute to the creation of this conceptual space, including world building, function advancing, and knowledge framing. And I don't want to get into the detail of that, but the identification of such features means that for Wirth, text worlds are rich worlds, constructed, as Gavins and Ernestine Leahy explain, from dialectic markers in a text that represent human experience rather than mathematical modelling. Of particular relevance to my exploration of place writing is the way that, as Alan Gibbons has asserted, text world theory is founded on a powerful conceptual metaphor of immersion, text as world. As Gibbons goes on to elucidate, the metaphor recognises that processing any discourse involves constructing a mental representation which can be so vivid as to be comparable with the experience of the real world. So, in short, and I'm conscious people on this call might know more about cognitive linguistics than I do, but in short, text world theory then can provide a linguistic conceptual framework for understanding how the reader can become invested intellectually and effectively in works of place writing. Put plainly, it is a microstructural model which can be harnessed to advance thinking about the cognitive impact of the detail, the nuts and bolts of the language to be found in place writing texts. So text world theory then is working at times at the level of the individual sentence and thinking how that creates conceptual space for us as readers. So if that's the first theoretical context, then the second one relates to story worlds. And shifting the focus from cognitive linguistics, the most influential work in narrative studies on the concept of immersion, according to Miranda Anderson and Stefan Everson, has been Marie-Laure Ryan's Narrative as Virtual Reality. Excuse me. A theoretical study first published in 2001 and reissued in revised and expanded form 14 years later. One of Ryan's foundational starting points is that conceptual consideration of the aesthetic experience of readerly immersion has not largely been neglected in contemporary criticism, as it is a practice commonly associated with intellectual and imaginative passivity rather than the self-reflectivity that's a defining characteristic of modern literary critical thought. To become cognitively immersed in literary work involves, or so the argument goes, a relinquishing of the reader's critical faculties as the text is perceived and experienced as merely the source of, and I quote, lowbrow escapist gratification. As a result, in a ventriloquizing of skeptical scholars, Ryan sets herself a challenge. What can be said about immersion in a textual world except that it takes place? She responds by saying that immersion can be an adventurous and invigorating experience, and she spotlights the complex mental activity that goes into the production of a vivid mental picture of a textual world. And here is where cognitive linguistics and cognitive narratology come together, really. So key to this process, as Ryan says, is the potential for the reader to identify with the text world in which they find themselves. She says, for a text to be immersive, it must create a space to which the reader, spectator, or user can relate, and it must populate the space with individuated objects. She then complicates this understanding of readerly immersion, which historically has been applied to genre fiction. And she says, actually, difficult and complicated text can also create a sense of readerly immersion as well. We just have to rethink what is meant by readerly immersion. And in this sense, and with complicated text, part of the immersion is based on the struggle and the intellectual struggle to understand what is happening in that particular text. She then goes on to say that further conceptual thinking about readerly immersion has been facilitated since the mid-90s by scholarship emerging out of a range of disciplinary fields, including media studies and psychology, as well as literary studies. Acknowledging her indebtedness to such thinking, as well as the post-Heideggerian thought of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Ryan develops an understanding of what she calls the poetics of immersion, as a readily experienced, premised on the phenomenological idea of consciousness as a sense of being in the world, or in this case, in a simulated world. She argues in the 4th chapter of her book that this poetics of immersion can be generated by 3 different elements to be found in literary works. First, she explores spatial immersion, which can be summarized as the reader's response to setting. Excuse me. According to Ryan, language is not an ideal medium to convey the presence of a place, as it can only describe it detail by detail, bringing it slowly into the reader's mind. A problem in her eyes, anyway, which prompts the creative challenge as to how a literary work can capture the feel of a place, both its atmosphere and its topography, without losing the reader in a descriptive thicket. Ryan goes on, however, to identify a series of techniques the writer can use to spatially immerse the reader, techniques that can include the focalized sense of a body moving through the world, the use of place names, and the detailing of particularities. So that's the first type of immersion. Second, she refers to temporal immersion, the reader's response to story as shaped by their involvement in the process by which the progression of narrative time distills the field of the potential. As Ryan explains, the passing of time matters to the reader because it is not a mere accumulation of time particles, but a process of disclosure. Third, Ryan examines what she calls emotional immersion, the reader's response to characters within a literary work. Ryan acknowledges that philosophical reflections on literature's capacity to elicit emotional responses can be traced way back to Aristotle and have been advanced over recent years through developments in psychology and neuroscience. Crucially, she argues that 3 types of emotion are particularly conducive to readerly immersion. Subjective reaction, 1, subjective reactions to characters and judgments of their behavior. 2, empathetic emotions felt not for oneself, but for others. So we're thinking about and feeling for the characters in the text, whether they be fictional or non-fictional. And third, as readers, when we are immersed, we have emotions felt for oneself, not for others. So she's saying that we're also thinking about ourselves in the act of immersive reading. So I've set up 2 contexts there for thinking about immersion. And to go back to the arguments I made before, in order to think about readerly immersion and place writing, I think there's a 3rd context, and that is thinking about geographical immersion, and in our case, the representation of geographical immersion. And there's been a lot of, or some thinking about geographical immersion in the work of geographers and other spatial theorists over recent years to understand, perhaps unsurprisingly, the bodily experience of being in water. And more particularly over recent years, some scholars have used such discourse when exploring the cultural phenomenon in the UK and Britain and Ireland anyway, of wild swimming. In setting up a critical examination of swimming as a healthy body-water engagement at various sites in Ireland, for example, Roland Foley acknowledges how swimming and other forms of immersion in natural water bodies have long histories of therapeutic acts within blue space. Similar territory is occupied by the human geographer Sarah Atkinson, who reflects on the distinctive quality of immersion in an alien medium, as she puts it, when investigating wild swimming in the 2010s. Clearly then, immersion is a useful term for thinking about a practice which is often framed in terms of well-being, which draws attention to the body as the site of emotions, sensations, and social encounters. But geographical thinking about immersion goes beyond or outside of water. And as Susan Owens puts it in a brief discussion of much recent nature writing, merely walking through the landscape is no longer enough. We have to get inside it. Correspondingly, the concept of immersion has also been applied to some of the way human subjects have become absorbed within non-aquatic geographical environments. So there's been research, for example, which has thought about different kinds of immersion experienced in the practice of forest bathing. And that work by Yuqin Zhong and Hirofumi Vida has thought about the psychological concept of flow in relationship to this. Alternatively, in a literary geographical article exploring the subterranean landscapes of the Peak District in England, Jess Edwards considers how the experience of going underground, with its sensory foregrounding of the sense of touch, is inevitably one of involvement or immersion in the experience of the body. The language of immersion has also been applied to the experience of human-made sites, and to offer one particularly memorable example, Les Roberts reflects upon his embodied immersion in the unlikely landscape of a motorway traffic island in northwest England, a space that is ordinarily marked out in terms of its placelessness and abstraction, rather than as a location for a richly phenomenological experience. Crucially, though, the concept of material immersion can also be applied to the general normative condition of being in the world. In their introduction to the Routledge Handbook of Place, Tim Edensaw, Aris Kalandides, and Uma Kathari point out that in the 1970s, the new humanistic geography was advanced to counter the way that the discipline had come to be dominated by scientific quantitative positivism. Drawing upon existentialism and phenomenology, humanistic geographers such as Yi-Fu Tuan and Edward Ralph argued that a sense of place was an intrinsic part of the human condition. As Edensaw, Kalandides, and Kathari underline, in humanistic geography, people are immersed in place. The concept of immersion in place can be traced in geographical thinking of other scholars whose work has similarly emerged out of the phenomenological tradition. David Seaman, for instance, has asserted that the life world, the typical context of everyday experience of which most of the time we are unaware, is premised on what he calls a taken for granted immersion in world. In other words, the unfolding of the everyday is characterized by what Seaman has described elsewhere as the always already lived embeddedness of human beings in their worlds. Immersion is a comparably important term for David Abram. In his chapter on air in The Spell of the Sensuous, for example, he argues that, and I quote, "Only as we begin to notice and to experience once again our immersion in the invisible air do we start to recall what it is to be fully a part of this world." As Abraham goes on to explain, as we become conscious of the unseen depths that surround us, the inwardness or interiority that we've come to associate with the personal psyche begins to be encountered in the world at large. We feel ourselves enveloped, immersed, caught up within the sensuous world. So I'm conscious of time, and so in the time that I've got left, I will just want to then pull together the theoretical coordinates to just briefly illustrate how these ideas can be brought together and enlaced to advance the understanding of the immersiveness of works of place writing. And the way place writing Texts generate readerly immersion through a nexus of linguistic features, narrative structures, and the representation of geographical experience and knowledge, can be illustrated by turning to a paradigmatic text, Under the Rock, The Poetry of a Place, by Benjamin Myers. A writer from the north of England who was more famously associated with the writing of fictional folk horror. I'm not making, and want to stress this, I'm not making any significant literary critical claims for the primacy of this work within the field of place writing, but rather it is an exemplar text which contains many of the common tropes and features that have become synonymous with this mode of creative non-fictional writing in Britain and Ireland. According to the geographers Owain Jones and Paul Cloke, literary representations of place do not go beyond the everyday, they try to move towards the everyday in all its richness. It is a description which can be readily applied to Under the Rock, a literary work in which Myers is preoccupied with the start of what he hopes to be a long relationship with place, as he documents everyday life in what he calls the post-rural landscape of the Upper Calder Valley in West Yorkshire in the north of England, following his relocation from South London. The overarching narrative arc of the text, then, is grounded in the durational process of the author deepening his familiarity with the landscape in which he has made his home. As a result, readerly immersion is created by Myers's articulation of the chronological thickening of his place attachment in this northern landscape. The reader turns the pages of the story world to find out how the author narrator has settled in the Upper Calder Valley, which you can see on the screen, and to vicariously experience the hyper-localized geographical knowledge he has accumulated through the practice of everyday life. The process of generating readerly immersion begins with the one-sentence paragraph which opens the introduction. It says, "Picture a hill half blasted into history." Immediately, the reader is explicitly instructed to enter the conceptual space of a text world. The first half of this sentence urges the visual imagining of a material landscape, whilst the second half creates imaginative intrigue through its intrinsic ambiguity. The reader then is encouraged to move on to the slightly longer second paragraph. This is on the screen. Imagine one side of this great hill torn away, hewn and cleaved, quarried and pillaged, dumped in and raked over, hacked and scarred, its face forever disfigured, like that of a Passchendaele survivor. Here, the piling up of the verbs of violence creates a thick description of a geological landscape that has clearly been battered over a sustained period of time. By extension, the reader immediately finds themselves immersed in a richly visual text world, with the closing simile generating a sense of the uncanny strangeness of this terrain. The reader's immersion is deepened in the introduction as the seemingly omniscient narrator imagines the deep history of this northern landscape before noting the destructive impact of human industry. Over just 4 pages, the reader is expected to carry out a significant amount of imaginative labour as the text world moves through time at a dizzying pace. Significantly, though, this text world is consistently anchored by geographical materiality, as the narrator describes wooded dells and dark lanes of hedgerow and holloway, mud and sandstone. It is further rooted when, towards the end of the introduction, the narrator unexpectedly slips into the first person and the present tense, as the reader is invited to imagine the author at home, as he puts it, in this landscape under Scout Rock. And it's on the screen. "Here I sit now within its creeping shadow, a dark presence blackening my bitter coffee, darker still. I drink it in." The focalization at the end of Myers' introduction, therefore, serves to draw the reader into an imaginative world, particularly predicated on the deep mapping of this crag, of this hill that dominates the landscape around the village of Mithelroyd, which coincidentally, if you're interested in English poetry, was also where the English poet Ted Hughes lived until the age of 7. Over the course of Under the Rock, the teleological quest narrative of Myers' growing understanding of this wild place is repeatedly punctuated by the tireless documentation of his physical immersion in place. At the start of the text, Myers explains, through a continuation of the first-person present tense I just mentioned, how he's come to know the landscape through pedestrian practice. As he puts it, "Walking defines my early days in this new terrain." The use of walking to generate and thicken knowledge of the local and the near at hand is a defining trope in many place writing texts during the 2010s. Further on in Under the Rock, however, Myers voices his long-standing compulsion to move beyond mere surface understandings of topography. Since I was young, I've always wanted to be in the landscape, not passing through, skirting over, or observing it from a distance, but in it. This impulse to be immersed leads Myers to map the local environment as a waterscape, as he describes how he's drawn to the pools, streams, rivers, and reservoirs that define what he calls this terrain of seasoned wonder. As the place writer expresses it, these are the places in which I come closest to being in the heart of it all. According to Susan Atkinson, swimming exerts all parts of the body and involves awareness of all the senses. Myers confirms this idea as he asserts how swimming is not even always about the act itself, but rather the immersion in landscape, the subversion of form, and the frog's eye view that is gained. So in a passage which underscores the place writer's long-standing engagement with this landscape, Myers announces he's been coming to this pool for several years before describing an experience of swimming here one September morning. And this is on the screen. Around me, the first leaves continue to fall. I drink a mouthful of the pool and let the flow take me, pushing me away to the shallows. A piece of fleshy Jetson reclining on his back and clumsily expelling a small fountain of this cold, dark tea up into the perfect autumn morning. An exhale on my own imaginary elbow. Here, Myers' world building enables the reader to enter conceptual space in which they can imagine the I, presented here in typically self-deprecatory terms, as a body immersed in this wild pool. The use of the continuous present tense, another key feature of many place writing texts published in the 2010s, enhances the reader's immersion, generating a sense of the one moment to the next unfoldingness of Myers' geographical experience. In contrast, the short final sentence moves out from the now as the author narrator casts himself as a Napoleonic figure, a casual aside which reveals how, even when imaginatively immersed in the text world portraying a particular place, the reader can also be invited to imagine another geographical location and another moment in time. And I'm almost there. For Myers, physical immersion also unfolds outside of water as he articulates his desire to become immersed so totally that it scratches the skin and stains the pores. This sense of bodily immersion is evident in his accounts of habitually visiting Scout Rock Woods, a deep green space where he's visually enclosed on all sides by rock and root and bramble, an environment where in early summer, the trees create a corridor and the night comes alive with bats. Myers also repeatedly falls over in this landscape. As he puts it, I slip rather than trip. In the greasy soil or from rocks whose gleaming surfaces are slick as engine oil, down holes unseen, I crash through dead bracken, fall onto moss mattresses. Onto the Rock, therefore, contains multiple moments when the reader finds themselves within a text world in which the writer narrator becomes physically immersed in sylvan and telluric or geological as well as aquatic environments. In his narrative, Myers moves out from such detail of place to explore a wider set of social and environmental issues, including, unsurprisingly, the climate emergency. Crucially, however, the reader engages with such wider thinking, having been pulled down through a series of immersive techniques that include the reproduction of the author's own black and white photographs and the inclusion of short poetic fragments framed as field notes. So all these things come together to pull the reader down into Myers' place-based story world. A text which, through the first-person focalization, is rich with thick descriptions of the visceral, polysensory, and immersive experience of living in the shadow of Scout Rock. And thank you very much for listening. So I'll stop, if it works, I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you so much, David, for immersing us in this immersive experience. So we're going to see if there are questions for you. Anybody?
Well, if the students are silent, I have a question. I thank you very much for your very informative lecture, which is a very helpful and interesting introduction to a field I myself don't know at all.
Yeah.
And thinking of what you said about place writing, I wonder, would you include like Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey or the romantic concern with place and nature, or the philosophy of nature as, you know, a window towards universal consciousness that can be found there, on one hand. And then would you also include poems like meditative poetry on place, like the one of T.S. Eliot, Four Quartets, or Theodor Roethke's. Theodor Roethke has a series of poems very much influenced by Eliot, Far Field, which is about landscapes. I wonder.
Yeah, thank you. There's two points there. Interestingly, my first and going back to quite a lot of my PhD was about Wordsworth.
Oh,
and so and I worked at Wordsworth Cottage, at Dove Cottage in the Lake District for quite a long time. So that was my background. So and I think a lot of this contemporary writing about place does owe, in Britain anyway, and Ireland, is influenced, whether explicitly or implicitly, by romantic notions of place. And I think, so I think in that general or broader definition of place writing, I definitely include a poem like Tintern Abbey, which is about that particular place and the experience of revisiting that place and the imaginative power of that particular place. So I definitely would in that broader definition of place writing. Same with Eliot as well. And I think I guess I was saying two things. That on one hand, I do think like travel writing, place writing is a really broad field or broad genre. Whereas if travel writing is about moving through, then place writing is more about stopping and pausing and sort of looking and detail at a particular location. So I think on the one hand I'm saying that, and the other I was saying though, I just think for me, and that broader definition of place writing I think is true. For me, I think the term is particularly helpful for thinking about these creative nonfiction texts, which in sort of British and Irish literary culture at the moment, no one quite knows what to call them because they're a sort of nature writing, there's sort of autobiography, there's sort of history, there are all these things, but place writing seems to be a really helpful label to try and understand those texts.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody? I have questions and things I'd like to know, but amongst the students, maybe questions? Okay, let them just come up with something. If I can say something, David, I find it very interesting that at a time when we are mostly online, there's this interest in place writing. And not only place writing, but this kind of hypersensitivity to place that I perceive in immersive writing, this being in landscape. That I forgot who said that. Somebody said that. You mentioned that. So, it's like, it's not the flaneur that, kind of goes by and looks and reports. This is an immersive experience into place. And I wonder, what's the role of sound in this experience of feeling place and this kind of hypersensitivity to place? What would you place sound or noise, if at all?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And there's two things there. I take your point completely that I think the interest in place as, and the return to place, if you like. So geographers have gone from talking about space a lot to then going back to place. And so 10, 20 years ago, no geographers or very few geographers were talking about place. It seemed old fashioned, and there's been this return. And I think partly, yeah, to do with digital technologies and people feeling that they're spending so much of their lives having life mediated through this. So I think that I agree with that. I think that's an important context. The issue of sound, I think, is fascinating. And I'll defer to, I've just supervised a PhD by a writer called Virginia Astley, who's a poet and musician.
Mm.
And her PhD was all, it was called The Singing Places, and it's all about sound. And she made me think a lot, because I think a lot of this writing, so Virginia argued, a lot of place writing, sound might come into it a little bit, but she says is not necessarily foregrounded. And so I think in those immersive representations of place, sound does come into it, but in my reading, but in Virginia's reading, not enough. And so, but she was saying, like, I guess it's how we experience place. So I maybe I don't know whether people here think like this, but if I go to a place or to a new city, Virginia would say to me, "How did it sound?" And I'm not sure that's a question I would ask. I think I'm probably my experience of place is probably dominated by the visual, which was always a criticism of Wordsworth, to go back to Wordsworth, that actually the visual dominates. And I think place writers do think about sound. According to Virginia, they could think about it more. But yeah, I think that's a hot course in terms of creating an immersive world. Sound is so important and is all around. And we could think about like the work of theorists like Murray Schafer, who really thinks about sound in a sort of really rich way.
Yeah, I think it's it's really crucial to our understanding of place, not only in terms of sound, but in terms of noise and how we make that difference between sound and noise.
Yeah.
Come to think of it, there's so many ingredients or parts or aspects to this immersive experience. When you go to a new place, they all have different sounds, different noises, but also different smells.
Yeah.
If I go to England, my immersive experience will be different from your coming over. So this is just such a complex experience, and it's all related to place and the many kind of subtleties that attend it.
And when you're just saying about sounds, I was thinking there's a writer, Ian Sinclair, a psychogeographer, who has been quite prominent in terms of place writing and he, in one of his books, The Last London, it's called, he really concentrates on the sound, how the soundscape of London has changed, and he's particularly sort of attentive to, but really annoyed by digital sounds that are around all the time, and the fact that you're just walking through London and listening to people on their phones all the time, and you're just having these weirdly strange, just getting sort of hearing half a conversation. And he's saying the soundscape of London is now dominated by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's another kind of side to place. Indeed. Yeah. All right. Anybody would like to come up with a question? No? PhD students?
I have a question,
All right.
but that's only because I'm ignorant. And I want to take advantage of your knowledge. You mentioned life writing. Is there a more specific term for this? I mean, if somebody writes, it's a question I have about genre.
Yeah.
If somebody writes about his life, but at the same time, there are philosophical discussions. And then he writes about history and then again about his life and exemplifies his idea with incidents of his life. This kind of genre, which is very new.
Yeah.
Do you know what the technical term would be?
I think that's a very good question. And I think the work on life writing, there's the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, and where they've been thinking about these sort of things. And I think where my argument about the term place writing being useful to describe texts which don't really fit into categories, I think they would argue that the term life writing would be useful to describe the type of text that you've just described.
But have you heard about ego prose?
Yeah, I've heard like variants of that. I haven't heard that phrase explicitly, actually.
Okay.
But that makes sense. It makes sense to me. But I also think that could sound, I don't know what you think, but that could sound slightly negative as well.
Oh, yes.
So it's the way that, which is potentially like tricky, but to go back to your point about, I don't think there is a term for that type of text that you've described, where it's sort of a writer thinking about themselves and then branching off into history. And I don't think, in my experience, a generic term doesn't really exist for that type of writing.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
I couldn't help thinking about Gloria Anzaldúa and Borderlands, because hers is an autobiographical experiment that blends poetry and prose with so many kind of excursions on history, but
Yeah.
it's all related to place and it's all related to language. The borderlands, slash La Frontera, at least two voices here, Spanish, English, among many other variants. But it's all related to place. It's all related from speaking from the borderlands. So it's life writing and it's place writing, and it's at the intersection of both.
And for me, in literary culture at the moment, some of the most exciting writing, just from a subjective point of view as a reader, exists in those sort of spaces, really, and
Right.
in those in between spaces where we don't quite know what they are in terms of traditional categorizations. And we have a master's in creative nonfiction at our university, and a lot of the students who want to do that are writing in those sort of spaces where they're writing, but they didn't quite know what it is. But I think that's a good thing.
Right. And there is code switching and there is cultural switching and this constant kind of crossing over into a different territory, a different language, a different culture. And not only like the crossing over and just saying bye-bye to your roots or your cultural tradition, but a constant just negotiation and crossing over all the
Yeah,
time.
completely.
Okay. All right. So if there are no more questions, just let me thank David Cooper for his wonderful talk, for being so, for giving us this introduction, not only to place, but also for immersing us in this idea of place. And I don't know, hope to have you on some other time, David.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, well,
Hopefully.
yeah, it'd be great to actually visit at some point. So yeah, that'd be brilliant. But yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to people for logging in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So everybody says thank you. Thank you. Sorry, this kind of online experience does not allow us to express gratitude or to clap, but you too.
I was going to say, I've seen people have put in the chat. If people did have any follow-up questions, they can always email me. So please do email me if there was anything that comes to mind.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, David. Good
All
luck.
right. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.